Welcome to this edition of Christian Author Interviews. My name is Shelley Hitz, and I will be your host today. I'm the co-owner of crossreads.com, where Christian readers and authors meet, as well as bodyandsoulpublishing.com, where we post free Christian books daily on our blog. My guest today is Dr. Richard Blackaby, and I'm really excited to have Richard here to be interviewing him. I recently was able to go to a conference that he and his father did at Glen Eyrie, and I was able to meet him, and so I'm so excited to have him. Dr. Richard Blackaby is the president of Blackaby Ministries International, which you can find more about their ministry at www.blackaby.org, and it's spelled BLACKABY.org, where he works with his father Henry and his brother Tom. He is an author and a popular international speaker. He's married to Lisa, and they have 3 amazing children, Mike, Daniel, and Carrie. Richard has a PhD in history. He loves reading biographies, and he loves hockey. He works with leaders in the home community, helping them develop their leadership to higher levels. Richard has co-authored the revision of Experiencing God and often speaks in churches and to Christian organizations. You can follow him on Twitter at Richard Blackaby, as well as on Facebook, which is facebook.com/Dr. Richard Blackaby. So welcome, Richard, and thank you for agreeing to spend some of your time with me today in this interview.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I was really, I've heard about Experiencing God and your father, and just the ministry that you guys have, and it's impacted me years ago when I first did this study. But when I went to the conference that you guys did at Glen Eyrie, I was really impacted by what you had to say as well on unlimiting God, and I want to talk about that a little bit later. But I just first wanted to start off just asking you about your family, and your family name in many Christian circles has become somewhat of a household name because of the success of Experiencing God. And yet, what was it like growing up in your family?
It was a very ordinary family in many ways. There was there were 4 boys and then a sister among my siblings, and my parents often did things the hard way. They would have a church that was growing and taking care of them, and then they'd leave it and go to some mission post or some struggling assignment, and where there wasn't enough money to buy enough groceries or to keep us up in new clothes, whatever else. And so it was a pretty ordinary, probably blue-collar sort of upbringing that we went through. But even though there's nothing spectacular about the home we grew up in or a lot of things, we always grew up with a sense that God was real, and that God, perhaps because we were in that situation, we really had to depend upon Him to provide for us. And so, in many ways you look at our family and think, wow, just a very ordinary group of people, but then you kind of watch a little more closely and you just see God doing things. And if God didn't do something, we were going to be in big trouble. And so we all just grew up in a home where we expected God to be real. We didn't expect to just wait till we died and went to heaven and then finally meet God and talk with Him. He was the real person we related to each week, and He was just a very central part of our family. And I suppose when we were young, we just took that for granted, and as we got older and looked back, we realized perhaps that was somewhat unusual for a lot of Christian families.
Yeah, I love how you say that you grew up in a family where you expected God to be real.
Yeah.
That is so key. And I see in our generation, because my husband and I have done a lot of work with teenagers and youth, that a lot of the younger generation is growing up not believing that, or maybe not seeing it lived out.
Yeah, I think they hear about God, and they are taken to church on Sundays, but week after week, they never see anything that would demonstrate that their parents actually followed a real person. It was, I've had so many people lately say, well, I growing up, raising my kids, I took them to church, but I don't know that I ever brought them to Christ. I just introduced them to a religion, but I never really helped them get to know the person of God Himself. And there's just a huge difference there, and I think that's why, estimates are perhaps 70% of kids who grow up going to church right now, when they hit college, they'll walk away from church and from God, maybe forever. And it's not that they haven't been exposed for years to what the church has to offer. It's just that what they've seen hasn't been all that impressive. They've seen a religion, but they haven't really seen a relationship with God.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And I just love how much you even mentioned, publicly, but also in your book, Unlimiting God, that how much respect you have for your own dad and how you just saw that lived out on a day-to-day basis. But now how, you're also, seeing that with your children. But I just saw in your book, Unlimiting God, how you talked about your dad was just an ordinary man, and yet he was one of the godliest men you have ever met. Explain this a little bit about what you meant by that.
Well, if you were to, I led a seminary for 13 years, so I learned how to train people to preach and teach and lead, and so I graded people on that all the time. So if I were to take those same evaluative skills and apply them to my father, I might have graded him technically at about a C level as far as being a pastor and having well laid out sermons and all that kind of thing. But what you saw happening around his life was just miraculous. And you'd say, well, he just seems like he has ordinary skills, ordinary intelligence and ability. Why is it that so many extraordinary things keep happening around him? And what I discovered just watching him was that he did the things anybody can do. Like he would get up at 4:00 in the morning just so he could spend enough time with God and really hearing from him and knowing him. And of course, that's a pretty brutal time for anybody to get up, but it's right. Something that people can do. Maybe not at 4, but if you really want to know more of God, any of us could push back the alarm clock a bit and spend more time with him. It doesn't take superior intelligence to do that. And so many things, he just made God a priority in his life, and he cut out other things so that God could be. And so the result was, even though he's a very ordinary person, I've been with him in the White House and watched him shaking hands with the president, and I watched him, go to the Pentagon or the United Nations or to counsel Christian CEOs of Fortune 50 companies and who've flown in on corporate jets just to hear what he had to say. And I look at this and I think, but he's just an ordinary person. Like, he's not unusually gifted in any of those senses of ministry. So why does he keep seeing such extraordinary things happen? And I think it's because he figured out, I serve an awesome God, and if I get my eyes off myself and stop telling God how ordinary I am, and instead I just am prepared to do and believe whatever God tells me next, I just expect that God's going to do amazing things in my life because he's an amazing God. And that's really been his message of experiencing God. It's what would happen if ordinary people just got their eyes off themselves and their limitations and just learned how to hear from God and then do exactly what God told them to do.
Mm. It really is simple, isn't it?
The most profound things usually are.
It's like you don't really have to complicate it, but we tend to complicate it. And I remember when you and your father were speaking together, he said some very simple things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. Spend time with God. Do these things. But there's no real. We don't have to complicate it, do we?
No, and I think our problem is we know the right words to say, but we don't really live them out. If I said, well, do you love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength? Well, yeah, I know that's the right answer. Yeah, I do. Okay, well, so what time did you get up to meet with him this morning? Oh, well, I'm not a morning person. Well, I thought you loved God. I mean, if you love someone with all of your heart, soul, mind, strength, I'd think you'd overcome that. How much time in the week did you spend, or what did you do? How ruthlessly did you look in your life to find something that dishonors this person that you love so much, so you can do away with it? Well, I know that this habit probably doesn't honor God, but I've been that way all my life. Well, I thought you loved him with all your heart. We say the words, or we say, if I ask you, do you believe God's all-powerful? Yeah, of course I do. Well, are you worrying about anything right now? Are you fearful of anything right now? Yeah, I'm actually worried about this and that. Well, I thought you believe God was all-powerful. Well, yeah, I do in my head, but in the way I live, I'm living like I really don't. And that's the essence, and that's why it fools a lot of people, because, when you list stuff and you say, well, do you know God? Yeah, of course I do. Well, when was the last time you heard him saying anything to you or guiding you in any way? Oh, well, he's never talked to me. I've never heard God say anything to me. Well, I thought you knew him. Yeah, but but he doesn't talk to me. I mean, I don't hear from him. In other words, he's not involved in your life in any way. You just follow rules you find in the Bible, and one day you assume you'll meet him when you go to heaven. But it's just all in our head, but it's not in our life.
Yeah, that's so true, and it's easy to get into a Christian culture, and like you said, know the right things to say, go to church, know the Bible, and yet not even connect with God. More than a couple minutes, maybe, of prayer before you eat, or, just to help me, God, or those types of things. And
we, and that's why when Experiencing God first came out in 1990, the number one thing we heard people say was, I've gone to church all my life, but I never knew this. I never knew God could be that real to me, that God actually wanted to be involved in my life. And you would say, well, why wouldn't you have been told that? You went to church all your life. But we were being taught a religion. We weren't taught a relationship.
Yeah, and that's powerful. It's like a paradigm shift, when you realize he's real. He really does.
Which it's sad that's news to a lot of Christians.
Yeah, which is sad, But I grew up in the church. I was a pastor's kid. I learned all the things, but it wasn't until, I was an adult that God began to teach me some of these things, and I really began to see him at work in my life, bringing healing, freedom, speaking to me. And, I regret those early years, but I'm so thankful that God has taught me that. And, I still struggle, and there's still days I don't spend with him and all of that. But,
the reality is people can't give to others what they don't have themselves. And so, I don't know your parents or the church you grew up in, but more than likely you were raised in a church and probably in a family that had not been taught themselves how to know God that way, so they couldn't teach you, and that's why we encourage people and encourage parents, if you come to understand how to walk with God that way, don't take it for granted that your kids will know how to do that. You need to help them learn how to recognize the voice of God, kind of like Eli did with the young Samuel. God was actually speaking to Samuel. No one had ever helped him know how to recognize God's voice before. It wasn't that God wasn't speaking. It was that Samuel just didn't know how to recognize it. He needed the older Eli, who had problems of his own, to help Samuel know how to respond when God was speaking. And I think that's what parents are supposed to do, and help their kids learn how to recognize when God is speaking to them, and to realize it's not just about serving in the temple and going to church every week. It's about responding to God when he reaches out to you.
Yeah, and that's so key, of having the parents teach. But like you said, I'm not a parent yet, but, for parents, they're not able to teach what they don't have themselves. And so what I'm hearing you say is the important thing a parent can do is spend time with God and have their own personal relationship, so that then they can pass it on to their kids. And as I say in that Unlimiting God book, which is one of the favorite, I think, truths I've ever really grappled with in my own life, is that's why you keep on growing. That's why you keep going deeper with God. I think too many Christians have just grown satisfied. They've just said, hey, I'm a good person. I go to church each week. I know there's more about God I could know or experience, but essentially we just say, but this is enough. And the problem is that the moment that you
become satisfied with where you are with God, it means you've just set a limit on what you can give to others. So, as a parent, if you've stagnated for years in the same place spiritually, then that's what your kids are going to grow up with. That's all you can give them, and that's all you can give your spouse, or that's all you take with you to church to give to other church members. And so I just urge Christians to say, how could you ever be satisfied staying where you are, when if you had more of God in your life, you would have more to give everybody around you? So basically, by stopping your own spiritual growth, you're robbing everybody else that you relate to.
Yeah, and that's such a great, thing to just meditate on. Have I, in my spiritual walk, settled, or just become complacent, or am I still growing? Am I still seeking? Am I seeing God at work in my life? If not, ask God. God, what do I, what do I need to do? How can I?
Of course, we always know the answer, but if I were to ask, and I won't ask you this, but if I were to say, so are you growing in your faith? And you'd probably say, I think I am. And so, I could come back and say, okay, well, great. So what's the latest spiritual breakthrough you've had? Tell me what kind of breakthroughs you've had in the last week or two where you learned something about God that got you really excited that you'd never known before, or you experienced some of His power in ways you'd read about but you'd never actually experienced before. But boy, just you've gone to another place because you experienced this or that. And if you said that to the typical Christian, I tell you, they'd be backpedaling in a hurry, to say, or because the average Christian, if you say, well, tell me about your walk with God, tell me what's going on in your walk with God, I'd say probably at least 90% of people would begin to tell you their testimony when they became a Christian. And if you said, well, do you have anything a little more current than that? Right. You became a Christian 35 years ago, so what's happened in the last year? You get a whole bunch of confused looks on people's faces, because after you tell how you were born again, a lot of Christians wouldn't have anything more to say about God's involvement in their life.
And we should.
Yeah, Almighty God's got a lot He can do.
Right. Yeah, and I just love when I read Experiencing God, or even, when I was reading Limiting God, it's just, I love that challenge of really expecting God to show up in a huge way, expecting Him to be powerful. And so many times, we do limit Him in our lives. But I had asked some of the readers and some of the people of our, the different sites we have, if they had any questions for you. And Stacey Stallings, she also commented that she loved the book Experiencing God as well, but she had a question for you, and she said, what was the biggest Red Sea moment you've ever seen? So Red Sea, as far as the parting of the Red Sea, the miracle that Moses saw, but what was the biggest Red Sea moment you've ever seen, either in your own ministry or in your father's? Why was it such a God thing rather than a man thing, and what about it took the most faith?
It's a great question, and there's been several moments like that in my life. I could share just either in my own leadership. I'd say sometimes the areas where I've felt sometimes the weakest and most desperate for God have actually been when I've been parenting. And it's one thing to see God change your own life. It's another when you're trying to see God work in one of your children's lives, and you feel helpless to do any more. And so a number of things like that. I remember a church I grew up in. Oh, I didn't grow up in. I was a president of a seminary, but I was raising my kids in it. And one of my brothers was the pastor, and I remember at one point, just a kind of a short version of it is that God was really blessing, and it wasn't a big church. It was probably running 130 people or so, but people were just being drawn to that church and filling it up, and needed a new facility, and so we began to pray, and the church owed $430,000, and it was church running 100, and many of those were poor families. Many of them were seminary students that went to the school that I was the president of, and So it didn't have a lot of money. There's no wealthy people in the church. And so the long story is we felt like God said, you need to build a larger auditorium. You can accommodate more people. And so the auditorium is ultimately going to be about 4 times the size of the current one. And but we really felt like God just said, but you've got to pay off the $430,000 first. And so for that kind of church, we thought that could take years to do that. But we really felt like God said, no, I really want you to take one offering and just get it done. And so we thought, well, should we get a professional company to help us market this and approach every family and figure out how much they ought to give? And we just felt like, no, what we felt like God said was, I don't want you to do any pressure. I don't want you to go visit everybody. All I want you to do is just let people know on this day we're going to ask every family to come and give only that which God has told you to give, nothing more. And so there were kids that started having Kool-Aid stands, trying to raise money so they could give something. My own son was a teenager. He started going without certain snacks and lunches so he could collect money and put an offering in himself. And so on that, and then that was actually over 9/11 took place, and the actual 9/11, and our offering was going to be the next Sunday. And so, of course, it's a huge distraction, and many people are giving money now to 9/11 causes, and so everybody said, you need to delay this. People aren't ready to give to a building campaign after all this, and people were just caught by surprise. And yeah, we felt like God said, but I wasn't caught by surprise. I knew what was going to happen, and I'm the one that told you to have this offering. So anyway, the bottom line was, actually it was $450,000. I'm already downsizing how big the miracle was. It's $450,000 we needed, and on that Sunday, almost to the penny, exactly $450,000 came in.
Wow!
And you looked at that, and you looked at the people that had given the money, and you thought, it's just impossible. There's just not that much money here. And how could it have been almost to the penny without some kind of human organization of it? But what it was we just saw God literally speak to every family and tell them, if you give this, you give that, you give that, it'll all come to exactly what the church needs. And I say that I've probably been a part of even bigger miracles than that. But what was special to me that day was that my wife, my 3 kids were all there in the auditorium, and the church actually, we took the offering in the morning, and nobody knew how much had been given, and we scheduled a party that night. And I thought, now that's something. If a church, I think the most the church had ever taken in on a Sunday before was maybe $30,000-$40,000. So this is many times more than its biggest offering. But we're scheduling a party to celebrate what God did before we know what God did. And
that's faith.
And I just felt for my brother. I thought, what does he do? Like when he gets up, how does he prepare his sermon? He doesn't. Does he have one sermon if we make it, and another sermon if we didn't make it? And but my kids, what I was so happy about was my kids got to grow up in a church that believe that when God tells you to do something, you just step out and do it. And when people asked afterward, well, so what program did you use to raise that much money for your church? We'd say, well, our approach was just hear from God and do what He told us. And a lot of people could not figure that out. That you can't raise that much and not have some kind of campaign. And it wasn't that God said don't ever use campaigns. He just said, let me just show you what it's like when my people simply follow me. And, so all my kids, and of course, after that, the next time God wanted the church to do something, they were ready to go because they had already witnessed what it looks like when you just hear from God and do what He says.
Yeah, it's, a lot of times it goes against what the world's, best advice would say. And, sometimes God will use those things, like you said, those, the campaigns and those things. But sometimes He asks us to do something that just seems contrary to...
and He does it in a way that will bring... He does it in a way that brings Him glory,
Right.
It's not that a campaign or, a fundraising banquet God can use any technique He wants to, But what often happens is we declare, oh yeah, our God's all powerful, he can do anything he wants, and then the next thing we do is taking matters into our own hand and acting as if God's not going to be involved at all. And I would say, well, you just need to learn to be consistent. If you do believe God can guide you and is all powerful and is a provider, then what you do next ought to reflect that. But oftentimes what we do next is exactly what an atheist would have done if he were trying to raise money as well. He would have done all the same campaigns and everything else, just like people who claim that they're following Almighty God. And I just don't think that we know how inconsistent our living is, that we say we believe one thing, but we live a different way.
Mm-hmm. And I bet leading up to that, just big moment of just seeing God work in such a huge way, there were so many little ways that as a church you were believing God and being obedient. And, that it was leading up to that, moment too. Like you said, the consistency of believing God even in the little things as well as the big things.
Yeah, and, just all the way down. In fact, when we first went to the city with our plans for an auditorium, they came back and said, you don't have enough space for parking. You can't build an auditorium like that on your property. And so we were told it was impossible to begin with, and we had to go back to God and say, well, God, are you trying to tell us that we should relocate or have another campus, or what are you telling us? Because the door is closed here. But as we prayed, we really felt like God said, no, I want you to build that right here. You're on the best street in town and most visible, and I don't want you to move. But we're saying, but the city says it's impossible. And so what was good is that each step of the way, the whole church was kept involved in that, so that everybody kind of knew what was going on. And as we prayed, we actually had an architect go back, and I to this day don't know what exactly happened, except that after being told repeatedly that it was impossible, one day the town came and said, well, we've checked some things and looked at a different approach, and you actually can build an auditorium that seats about 100 or so more than you're even asking for on the very space you want to. And we just saw God open the door. So but before we ever even raised the money, we already had watched God completely change a city council and, the bylaw people. And so, after just step after step, you watch God just open doors. You begin to realize, just because people say it's impossible, until you've heard from God, you really don't know if it's impossible or not.
Exactly. Now, I know that you could probably talk for hours on this, but maybe if you could just talk for a couple minutes. Like, if somebody's listening right now and they say, but Richard, I don't feel like I can hear God's voice. I don't feel like I know what he's asking me to do. Is it my idea? Is it just, how can I hear God's voice? I mean, is there, and just, I know it's something you could talk about probably for a long time. Is there something that you could share, or maybe a resource that you would recommend if you're struggling with that?
Well, my father and I several years ago wrote a book called Hearing God's Voice, and you can get that on our website or at Amazon or other places. And we just felt like it was probably the most crucial question a person could even ask. And if you've got to start there. And a lot of Christians would say that. I've never heard from him. But then in the next breath, they would also have to confess, I've also never done a study to find out how to know. I've never bought a book on the subject. And I'd say, well, study that. Learn how God speaks. Look in the Bible and see the numerous ways that God did communicate, and be relentless about it. Don't be satisfied and just say, well, I guess God just doesn't speak to me. Well, the fact is he may be truly speaking. You just have never been taught how to recognize his voice. And I've walked with a number of people that said that. They said, well, God doesn't speak to me. And, I asked them half a dozen questions, and before they knew it, it became obvious God was speaking all over the place. They just hadn't recognized it, or they didn't want that to be God's answer to them, so they kept on looking. And so, I'd encourage people, get a book like Hearing God's Voice, and do your own Bible study, and just at the outset say, God, would you open my heart and ears and mind and eyes to recognize what it is you are communicating with me right now. And it might surprise you that God's speaking a lot more than you even realize.
Yeah, I love how you say, many times it's learning how to recognize, because many times God is speaking, but we're not always recognizing it. And so, yeah, I encourage, if anyone is listening and they're struggling with that, I encourage you to, get Richard's book and, How to Hear God's Voice, or, just get into the scriptures, look up the passages and know that you can hear God's voice, that you don't have to go through life without that guidance and direction. He wants to lead us. He wants to guide us. And, that's available for us.
And just put aside any preconceived ideas. I've not had God speak out loud to me, and that's a lot of times people say, I've never heard God's voice, and what they mean is, I never heard an audible voice. And I'd say, well, that's just one way He speaks. Look in the Bible. There, in our book, Hearing God's Voice, we list dozens of ways God spoke, and sometimes it doesn't even say how He spoke. It just says He did. We don't know what the manner was at all, because in the Bible, it never really mattered how He did it. It was just that He spoke. And so I think the problem is we look in one place and say, well, no, I haven't heard from God there yet. God must not speak. But if we learn to look other places, we'd realize, yeah, but He's communicating in half a dozen other ways. It's just not the ways we're watching for. And so most of the time when I walk with somebody, invariably, it doesn't take long before it becomes obvious that God has been communicating. In fact, even the fact that you have a hunger to hear from God is actually an indication that God's at work in your life, giving you that hunger and desire. And now you just need to trust Him as He shows. Don't just let Him give you a hunger to hear from God and then take the rest of it up yourself. Once He begins to alert you to that need, just keep letting Him show you then how it is He is going to speak to you. And it may well be in a way you never even imagine, but that might be the way God's choosing.
Right. Yeah, I think it's so key, and it's so foundational to, much of, even what you share in experiencing God, or, it's just, being able to hear God's voice so that then we can obey. And, take those steps of faith. But now you've ended up, you've written quite a few books, and you've co-authored books, both with your father, and did you grow up thinking that you were going to be an author and do all of this?
Yeah, no, I when I was a kid, I used to like writing stories, but never thought I'd actually do that. My dad didn't write his first book till he was 55, so wow. He didn't grow up planning to be an author either. What he did is he developed a life message, and that's really what I saw with Experiencing God was, even then, the story behind that book is that it almost never was written because he never had the time or thought he was an author. It wasn't like he came up with this great book idea and then started submitting it to publishers. He was just being asked to share what out of the overflow of what God was teaching him. So he just, whenever someone said, "Hey, Henry, every time you speak, it just seems so real and fresh and insightful. Would you come here and speak?" And, well, okay, I'll do that. And so he just, that's all he was doing was just sharing what he was learning. And finally, a publisher heard him and said, "Hey, this is just amazing stuff. Have you ever thought about writing?" My dad said no, and they had to hound him to finally get that book written. So, I looked at that and thought, no, this is not a guy who ever wanted to write. It's a guy who had a message to share. And finally, the publishers found him. And and so that's always kind of been the model for us. Has been I've prayed and said, God, I don't want to write just to write. I want whatever I put down on paper, I want it to be something that you've put in my heart and give me a passion for. It's something I think really would help people if they were to read it. And so, there's different approaches people have toward writing, but in our lives, at least, our family, it's always come out of a need that we've seen that people have as we're speaking and teaching, and then ultimately a publisher's said, hey, we'd love to have you put those thoughts down on paper.
Yeah. Now, I know we have a ton of Christian readers, that will be, listening to us, but we also have some Christian authors. And do you have any encouragement for Christian authors, or, just any advice or anything like that for those that are actually authors?
Well, certainly, to take time to develop a message. It's the message that will ultimately drive a book, and especially if you're writing nonfiction, but I suppose any kind of genre, write in a way that changes lives, and write in a way that impacts people, and that when they put your book down, they can't live the same way they have been. And also just to say, folks like you and others, there's so many great resources out there now to help people get the message out. It used to just be the traditional means of if an established publisher wanted to take it and print it, and it would get out there. But now with social media and self-publishing and self-marketing and so many different tools now, people don't have to be restricted to vainly sending a manuscript to a publisher and hoping that someone will read it. There's so many different ways, and I think that's what's good about social media and other things is that don't wait until you've got a 400-page manuscript all neatly typed up before you begin sharing your thoughts and ideas. Just wade in and start sharing truth, and then watch and see how the truths that God gives you impact people's lives. And I've seen people that took their blogs that they had written and ultimately put it in a book, or insights that they've been tweeting ultimately came into a book. So get out there and just start sharing ideas and watching to see how those truths set people free, and that'll kind of be a guide as well to help you know what you ought to be putting into a book one day.
Yeah, that is great, and I always recommend that authors don't wait to start, building a platform on social media and such until after their book is written, but to start right away and to start sharing what God has on their hearts. And it's amazing with the Internet, with ebooks, how you can literally impact people. God can use you to impact people all around the world. And I'm sure you receive letters and emails from people all around the world from your books. And
it's amazing when you tweet something, and then the next thing you know, you're being retweeted by someone in India or Australia or someplace. You realize, wow, this seconds after I've just put a thought out there, and already people on another continent are being impacted by it and sharing it with all their network. And of course, you have just no idea where that goes, how viral that can become. But so I just say, be praying, letting God first put it in you, and as soon as God's given you something, then you share it and just watch what God does with that.
Yeah, and that's so great. Now, to kind of close up things, I had heard you share about unlimiting God, and you shared a really great session on joy and how so many Christians live without joy, or how we limit the joy in our lives. And I just thought maybe just to kind of as a closing, maybe you could just share just a few minutes about kind of what you mean by how we can limit our joy, and if someone is today feeling like they're one of those Christians that doesn't have much joy in their life, what would you recommend for them?
Well, that has more and more been something that has just so impressed me. How many people are faithful church attenders, faithful Christians, moral people, God-believing people, but they're joyless. They don't have any joy, and their children growing up in their home are not experiencing joy. And there are a couple of verses that, certainly in Unlimiting God, I talk about that, how you can put a limit on the joy that God wants you to have. A book I wrote last year called The Seasons of God is another one where I really try to unpack what that looks like to have a home that's filled with joy. But there's a couple of verses, Psalm 16:11, it says, "In your presence is fullness of joy." That means when you're abiding in Christ, when you're walking closely with God, if you get close enough to God, you're going to experience fullness of joy. That's John 15:11. Jesus said, "The whole reason I've told you all this stuff is so that my joy will be in you, and your joy will be full." And so what Scripture indicates is when you're walking closely with God, you will have His joy. The problem is that there's a lot of things in life that draw our attention away from God and abiding with Him. And problems come and critics criticize, and before we know it, we're actually not walking. We may still be going to church every Sunday, but we're not abiding in God's presence the way we ought to. And that became a warning sign for me. If in the midst of doing lots of good things, I suddenly realized I didn't have joy anymore, that was my warning sign that I was no longer walking as closely with Him as I ought to be, that I'd let my problems pull me away from His presence. And so I need to get back into His presence. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to have problems or that you won't have critics, but it just means that if you're abiding in His presence, then there's nothing that you can experience that's so awful that it can cancel out the joyful sense of being in God's presence. That's kind of what happens in Acts 6, chapter 16, that Paul and Silas are arrested, they're beaten, they're thrown in jail, but they're still abiding in the presence of God. Their enemies took away their freedom and their clothes and their dignity, their health. Their enemies took away all kinds of stuff, but what they couldn't take away was the presence of God. And as a result, at midnight, they're still singing hymns of praise. And so what I realized in my life is that whenever I was joyless, it was not because people had taken my joy away. It was because I had surrendered it. And I just, in my own life, got to the point of realizing life is too precious and too brief to spend it joylessly. And so that's not just a simple answer, not a cliche. If someone today is listening and truly would just say, I've lost my joy, I would say the place to find it is in the presence of God. To come to just enjoy Him, spend time with Him. Doesn't matter if you lost your job or you lost your spouse. It doesn't matter what you've lost. The one thing that you can always enjoy is God and His presence. So learn just to enjoy Him. Learn to spend time with Him. And out of that relationship, let Him begin perhaps to create for you a life and a family, a home of joy.
That is so powerful. And I've even found myself sharing with people after I heard you speak, just that, the scripture in Psalms, in the presence of God is the fullness of joy. And joy isn't the same thing as happiness. It's not dependent on our circumstances. It's that inward joy that God can give us no matter what is going on around us.
Yeah, and it comes back to that relationship again, because for a lot of people they've been taught to go to church. But it doesn't say at church is fullness of joy.
Yeah, exactly.
It says in God's presence. And so a lot of people say, well, I go to church every week, but I'm really sad. I say, well, God didn't promise you going to church would make you joyful. He said learning to enjoy His presence, that relationship. And unfortunately, a lot of people have never been helped to know how to do that. So that's why I think there's so many joyless Christians. They go to church every week, they may do their Bible readings, but they don't know how to really enjoy God. Yeah.
And I encourage any of the listeners that want to dig in deeper to that, to get one of Richard's books, The Unlimiting God, or Richard, you said it was The Seasons of Life.
The Seasons of God, yeah.
Oh, The Seasons of God. Seasons of God, to dig into that deeper. And if you just want to grow in that relationship with God, you want someone to walk beside you and to help you, Experiencing God is a great book to do that. Or, the book that Richard mentioned, Hearing God's Voice. And so I really encourage you to check out the books, that Richard and his father, Henry Blackaby, have written. You can check out more, find out more about their ministry at blackaby.org. That's BLACKABY.org. You can find their books on Amazon and other retailers. And then I encourage you to get connected with Richard. He's available on Twitter. You can find him at Richard Blackaby on Twitter, or on Facebook. He's also there, facebook.com/Dr. Richard Blackaby. Let him know how the interview today impacted you, or questions you have, or start following and just reading some of the things that he shares and interact with him there. But thank you so much, Richard, for this time, and I just pray that God uses it to impact many.
Well, thank you. It's been great to be with you.
again, this is Shelley Hitz, and I'm so glad that you tuned in. And this was an interview with Dr. Richard Blackaby. Thank you so much for listening.